Hi, Nicole Chanis here today on 50's AF Podcasts. And as I've been alluding to, one of the things that I want to start talking more about is being a widow. And part of that, I think is an important thing to address because most women in their 50s are either coming from a divorce or being widow. And so I have chosen to start diving a little bit more in deep and hopefully reaching an audience that may not know they're going to become a widow. I know that sounds weird. Or somebody that finds themselves as a widow and the different stages of how to address that. So to start with, I want to just say something. There's this theories out there about being a widow. And I always like to drop a little tidbit here and there. So it says the widow word implies too much baggage. The widow word implies too much drama. The widow word implies a life of internal sadness. The widow word implies someone that needs to be rescued. Yep. That's what the general public thinks. And being on this platform, having the opportunity to discuss these things and having a guest that is unfortunately a member of the same club as me, being a widow, I'd like to welcome my guest today who is being so kind, and we're going to open up and have widow to widow conversations. And our hope is to help people out there, whatever stage you're at, to maybe be a little more comfortable or learn something or not be as sad and see some hope. So with that, I'd like to welcome Annette Mellon to 50's AF Podcasts, our widow to widow conversation.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I know, here, just move your mic a little closer to you. I know that this isn't easy. And I've been doing the podcast for quite some time. And it took me time to really even be comfortable with sitting in and having this discussion. For me, it's a little bit more complicated layers. So everybody needs to understand that Annette's version and her process and her journey of being a widow is different than my situation, me being a widow, my journey, and our time frame. So, Annette, would you share with our audience a little bit about when you became a widow and, your late husband?
So I lost my husband about 18 months ago.
That's not too long ago.
So it's very still recent for me.
And we have tissues, guys. Okay, just letting you know.
We were married for 22 years. And had a wonderful, happy marriage. Never thought in a million years that would be taken from me.
Who does?
No one does.
No one does.
So it's been a journey that I've been on, trying to adapt to a new normal. No one's ever given a manual on how to do this ride. And it's a club that, never thought I'd be in, especially at this young of an age.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way I feel. I mean, I was, let's see if I'm 55. I was young 50s very young 50s. And for me, my late husband was diagnosed with an illness. So I don't consider it a blessing at all that we had time to talk about things, discuss things, plan things, because quite honestly, and this is partially why I want to have these discussions, is as much as you plan in that situation, it all goes to shit in the moment of when your loved one becomes really sick. And so you think when you're with your spouse and you are talking about the possibility of these things, forget even being diagnosed with an illness. In general, that's why I constantly advocate for couples to discuss full transparency on everything, because anything can happen in life, and life should not be taken for granted.
No, and I think it's interesting because we all think that we have till old age. And I remember having humorous conversations with my husband that, he was older than me and that he'd be in a wheelchair and I'd be pushing him, in our old age. And
what was the age gap?
We were 12 years.
13.
He was 12 years.
Ours was 13.
And so I always envisioned, old age, growing old together. And, so no day is promised.
No day is promised.
No.
And I think that's part of the journey of becoming a widow is, there's so many steps to moving forward, and part of that is embracing, I think, a little more closer to our heart that nothing is a given. And, you can talk about with your spouse, whether you're making plans or in my case, a terminal illness and talking about it, easier said than done when he was always like, oh, I want you to move on. I don't want you to do X, Y, Z when I get really sick. All these things you can talk about. But when the time came in my situation, because it was planned, unfortunately, or we knew, in the moments, I was the only one he wanted. And when I say the things I had to do, I never envisioned doing. And as many aides as I had, it was me. And those visions take time for those of you that were caregivers. You can't push it. You can't erase those images. You can't. And what I can say is, in my situation is, unfortunately, you have to just wait. And at some point for me, it did become, I didn't just wake up and it wasn't the first thought, seeing him like he was towards the end, or, towards the end, the burial. I mean, those thoughts, first thing, last thing, took a long time to dissipate. Now, in your situation, Annette, your husband passed suddenly.
So it was about 6 months that he was sick, and that I was a caregiver.
Okay. Not suddenly, I'm sorry, but
right.
Yeah, not as many years, right?
Right. So it was about 6 months. And, during that time, I think as a caregiver, you're grieving during that time because what the final end result's going to be. And it was very hard because I felt like numerous times laying next to him, what do you say to somebody that has a terminal illness? It's not like they're having a cold and you can say, you're going to feel better tomorrow. Yeah. So we did have those conversations about, me moving on. And my husband had, he lost his mom when he was very young. And so he knew about grief and he kind of prepared me a little bit for it. It was interesting. And at the time, like I could listen to it, but until you're actually going through it. Yeah. And I try to remember his words and know that, it's a journey and, one day at a time.
It is one day at a time, and it really is. And I'm further along than you. And I can say, the 3rd year anniversary, that would have been our anniversary since he passed, this year was the first time that, you don't forget. But I like to just say I was okay. I wasn't a mess. And same with like my children, they adored him. And as a stepfather, he was there most of their life. And my son especially. And it was for both of us, you don't expect when it's going to happen. And it just happened that particular time, that day, we both kind of weren't a mess. We weren't like crying. Mm-hmm. We felt it. We acknowledged it. But it does, on everybody's timetable, eventually become a part of you always. Like I read those quotes, for a reason, because I think there's a misconception about being a widow and what comes with being a widow and dating a widow and her future.
Well, it's interesting, Nicole, because you brought up some of these phrases. Yeah. And I'm starting to hear that now that I'm, trying to date, where I hear men, are a little scared of a widow.
What do you mean? Like, what are they saying to you?
That they're a little nervous. They don't know where you are emotionally, as you said, that somebody may carry a lot of baggage or never heal. And it's interesting. I heard a rabbi explain to me this philosophy that when we have our first child, we think that the love that we have for that child can only be for one child, that how could we ever have another kid and love again? But then we have our second child and we love them just as much.
Yeah.
And so it made sense to me that, I will never stop loving my husband, but I have more love to give and the love will be different. And so, I sometimes explain to people that I'm meeting that, my heart is not in a place where I can't love again. And, I need somebody who can be emotional and have empathy with that.
I think that is so important.
So, maybe that's their own insecurity, and that's why they're scared of it.
Yeah, I think as my dating journey, I think being with somebody, they can't be intimidated by your late husband in our cases. We both discussed how we have had a fairy tale marriage. We both were very much in love. And yet it takes a man to understand we're not looking for you to fill those shoes because they're never going to. There's no duplication of your late husband in our cases. And, part of that is part of the journey of understanding. And I always talk about that, grieving. You have to go through grieving. I remember for me, of course, I had many years to prepare. And so my mourning was very long term. I like to call it different stages of mourning. And because his was, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's. So the hardest part for me was watching this brilliant man aware of losing his cognitive ability and his body and the strength and anger. He was very, very angry, rightfully so. And as you mentioned, what do you say when somebody is passing or terminal illness? It's not like I'm going to say it's going to be okay. No. And I remember one day I tried so hard to find some time, I had to I used to live where you live, and to walk the circle, I needed to get out. Obviously, he was with AIDS, and they would call me and say, you have to come home. And I remember this one specific time where he was a very stoic man. He was very low key and very conservative and not demonstrative about his emotions. And I'd never seen him cry in all the years, ever. And so when I got back, because they said I had to come back, he was in the wheelchair and he was holding the family album that was on our ottoman and crying. What do you say in those moments? Except for, I'm sorry. Chills. Yeah. And so I understand what you're saying. It's like, you can't say anything that's going to make it better. And I know in my situation, I don't know about yours, he was so frustrated and angry. And of course it was years, he took it out on me. So, some of us that were caregivers, you take it out on a loved one and you still need to be smiling and loving and caring while this person is basically not nice to you. And you have to be understanding of that and not take it personally. And so, I don't know if you experience, if within his time, if he ever got angry at all about his situation.
First of all, it was very difficult being a caregiver, but my husband was very sensitive that he allowed me, tennis was my outlet. And so I would go in the morning and I would play an hour and a half. And then we had, chemo and doctor's appointments always scheduled around after. So I would come home and I felt like I had a little bit of a break and then I was able to be there for him, throughout the day. And that helped me and he knew that I needed that. So, he gave me that space.
That's really sweet.
I think that helped. But, there were definitely trying times of impatience and times of, abrasiveness with needing me. And I couldn't be, laying in the bed all day long. So, that was difficult. And I needed times to go cry, and I couldn't cry next to him. I had to be strong. So
my late husband specifically said, no cry. You don't want anyone crying in front of him.
Right. It was difficult. I remember right after he was diagnosed,
excuse me,
my husband was a radiologist, so he read his own MRI.
So can you further describe how you handled, when he would be difficult?
It was hard. I had to try to really collect myself and know that I would turn my mind frame when he would scream my name. Instead of getting upset, I would say, treasure that moment of hearing his voice, because in those moments I thought, I'm not going to hear that yelling. So I really tried to turn my mind frame and take pleasure in him yelling.
That's a really interesting perspective. I wish I had thought about that. So that's great advice to give people, what you just said.
And that I really tried to change that mind frame. I remember times like he was in the hospital and I'd come home to that empty house, and it gave me glimpses into how it was going to be coming home to my empty bedroom. And it was slowly preparing me for that. And then when I would get to the hospital, I was even much more grateful to see him and to be with him, even if he was feeling, angry and not feeling well. I felt that I could be in that space because I knew that I didn't have that much time with him.
Right. And I know, and you raise a good point that I want to go into. I've talked a tad about this on my bedroom confessionals. I don't think I've talked about it in a podcast, but people take for granted that in a relationship, whether you're married, a partnership, whatever it is, that if you have a trust, everything's set up, everything's fine. You don't have anything to worry about. So when you talk about taking those moments, in my situation, it was a hot mess because I had to take over when he was declared, incompetent, basically. And he was very 1950s, old fashioned. Don't worry about it. I pay all the bills. You don't need. I knew not one account number, password, sign in. And this is a man losing his cognitive ability. So by the time I'm taking on everything, I didn't know where the money came from to pay the bills. I didn't know what account, because I didn't know how. And it sounds stupid, but you have no idea how angry during and after I was that I got robbed of those times spending with him, trying to figure out all that shit. And I'm a huge advocate for couples. Don't be uncomfortable to have the discussions of, listen, I want to make sure, spouse, every account, password, sign in, where the money comes from, because you know what? It took away. I got robbed of being there with him before he completely. Right. And I'm still angry about. I'm angry about that. And that's why, I say this not to beat a dead horse, but I want other people out there not to go through what I went through in my journey on that.
So similar to you, my husband, he paid all the bills. He did all of that. And I never was aware of any of it. The positive in it is that my husband was very organized. So, he had apps where all the passwords were stored. And so the last 6 months he went into immediate of, I'm going to show you everything and sit down with you. And so he did that. And because of his organization, that really helped me. However, as we got toward the end, I kind of was forgetting a lot of the stuff. And he was at that point too tired to take me through stuff. So I remember after he passed, I went into panic mode of, oh my gosh, how do I get into the computer and how do I start looking at stuff? And because of my notes and his organization, I think that saved me. But I will say, to other women that are widows that are going through this, and, whether you've had your loss or whether you're being a caregiver, it's important to have those conversations and to learn, even for married women. I mean, listen, don't take it for granted, that we are going to grow old with our spouse because it can happen at any age. So I think it's important to be accountable and to take ownership and to learn that and not feel helpless.
Yeah. And I think, especially men, I'll put that out there. I think a lot of them, when you've been married many years, just feel like proud in a way that I'm taking care of my family and wife or partner, I got you. And I leaned into that. I loved how he was like that. And
we felt like princesses.
We did.
And, I remember leaving the house and going to lunch with friends, and he'd be working or on the phone, with insurance companies. And he'd always say, "You're so lucky you don't have to do this." And, I never for a moment not appreciated it.
Yeah.
But now I have to do all of this. And I think back like I had it great because he did that all.
Right. And I think what we're trying to tell you, everyone out there, is two different scenarios. And whether, one of us, it was harder than the other, the point is that don't think just having a trust in place is enough to be organized. You have to have, and I think about even writing some of this stuff down, so everything. And, I'm not talking about necessarily like everything my late husband said he didn't want me to do, I did. Nobody can predict that. And towards the ends, it was 3 hours of sleep. I was sleep deprived, exhausted. I fell so many times in the shower taking care of him, breaking things and on my body. I mean, these are the things that you don't plan. And, nobody can. But to make it easier is to have that transparency so that that person that does become in a caretaking role, at least, can just, or, in a planned situation, have that ability to spend time together rather than figuring out how to keep the lights on. And I hate when people say I'm exaggerating, but how do I keep the lights on if I don't know where the money is coming from and what the account number is? And, but moving forward, so a little bit about, Annette and I and our journey, and of course there's people that find themselves, widowless, just happens overnight. But I would like to turn a little bit to, the aftermath. What does it mean as a woman in our situation, married, and the process? Now, everybody's, journey is going to be different. And with that said, I wonder, did you allow, I know after 6 months, again, I had years, but after 6 months, I finally took I was in bed for 6 months, easily. And I one day just said, Nicole, if you don't get up, sister, like no one's going to do it for you. And that was, I distinctly remember that was the start of me trying to move forward. What was it like for you that day, that moment?
So I think I went into superhero mode of, okay, I have to take care of my house and I have to take care of the bills and my children, and I couldn't stop. And so I don't feel like I ever went into a depressed mode of not getting out of bed. I just went and went. I didn't stop. And now I kind of feel like we're past that year mark, that the dust is kind of settling a little bit. And now I'm starting, not that I haven't been dealing with my grief, because I deal with it every day, But now we've passed all the 1-year markers, and I've been doing everything. And I look back and go, wow, I'm taking care of all of this and doing a good job at it. But now the dust is falling, and I find at times it's hard. And I'm still adapting to that new normal of, functioning every day.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think sometimes when you take on that superhero mode, it gets to a point where you just kind of crash.
Crash and burn.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's when I say I was in bed for 6 months. I was exhausted. I think it was more not depression. I was exhausted from everything.
Taking care and...
Yeah, and like you said, you have to be strong for your kids.
For everybody.
Yeah,
and
I felt like, I couldn't show that side to my adult kids. As it was, I then became like, it switched. It was almost like my adult kids felt like they were the parents of me and were constantly checking in. And I didn't want their 20s, upper years to be depressing and worrying about mom. So I always I felt like I had to put on a brave face because they don't live in Florida. So the times they would see me or something, I would kind of try and, be a little more peppy because they were hurting and mourning, and I didn't want them worrying about me. And that's something that happens with your kids.
Right.
So, you went into superhero mode, and that's very common. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now I'm dealing with my grief.
Right. I was going to say too, I think, after you do lose your spouse, so many people find that they haven't been planning for that. I mean, who would?
Mm-hmm.
Who goes and picks out their cemetery plots, in your 50s?
We actually did.
But
way years ago, we did.
Really?
But that's not where I buried him.
Huh.
Yeah, because not to interrupt you, but since his whole family lived out of state in one state, I thought it was selfish of me to bury their sibling and son, and in a different state. So
do you have a plot next to him?
Oh no, that's family drama shit. No, but and that alone is part of it. That's also another thing that you raised. Like, where is family during that time? I know we're kind of sidestepping here, but in my situation, they were not really there for me, his family. One sibling and their family was, but it was like, it was more my kids and myself that were helping and being involved and active. And to the point where one of his siblings thought I was being dramatic 2 weeks before he died and called somebody and said, is it really that bad? They weren't really tuned in. And the other thing I found out, and all his so-called good friends, not like in the community we lived in, that we used to for years do things with, none of those friends ever came by once. The only friend that came by all the time was a best friend that lived in the community for like 40 years. They were best friends. They are maybe less. And he was a doll. He was a sweetheart. He didn't stop coming up until the end. But you find something that is like, how dare you not come see him? But at the other hand, it's like, okay, they don't know how to handle it. But so for me, I found I was disappointed in his guy friends that they didn't rally during the time before he lost his cognitive ability either. I think there's a certain part of society that don't know how to deal with somebody passing, what to say, and they're uncomfortable.
Right.
Did you experience anything like that, or what was it like?
Absolutely. I mean, I sat Shiva for a week, and, there are people that, would come to me and they don't know what to say. And then there's some people that want to say too much. And, when you're grieving, I think it's important to just let the griever talk. You want to talk about those memories and because that's what kind of helps you process all that grief.
Right.
And I think somebody just needs to be there to listen. I don't need somebody to give me their advice. I mean, I had friends saying to me, I completely understand what you're saying. I lost my mom. And I said, I'm really sorry you lost your mom, but there's no comparison because you don't sleep with your mom and you haven't been in your mom's home for the last, 20, 30 years. So it's a very different. So just when people would say, I understand, no, you don't understand.
No, there's no comparison.
No.
I mean, I think marrying your child is probably right up there.
Right.
But anything else, I agree. And, so we move forward. You move forward after Shiva. Oh,
but I do want to say, Nicole, like with family, I feel very blessed, and I use the word blessed because when I met my husband, he was older than me and he had children from another marriage. And, I think when you're first dating, you sometimes don't want to marry somebody that has been married before because you don't want the baggage. But now looking back, I think it was like the best thing ever because I have such a great relationship with his boys and they have been there for me.
Aww.
And it's so nice. Like, I feel like my husband just left me with such wonderful gifts.
I got chills just now.
Yeah,
that was a beautifully
his boys
said
have
statement.
children. So I'm a grandmother of 4 and, it's just, that makes me feel so good that my husband lives within all his children. And, when I'm around them, it just it comforts me.
You're very blessed. Not everybody has that.
Right.
And to acknowledge that, and that probably helps you a little bit. Maybe, and I have to say, because, mourning and having that loving support does go a long way. And it does. And, so then, you move forward and you got to realize a next chapter in your life. And you acknowledge like, okay, at some point when you're ready in your journey, what does that look like for me? Do I want to be alone? Do I want to meet someone? And like you were talking about, with your husband, that talking about when you get old and pushing him in the wheelchair. We had the same conversations and I would make jokes like, if you pass before me, I'm putting my hand and pulling out of the grave, like it was, he was the healthiest man in the world. And it was like the last thing I would have thought would have happened. And we looked forward to, we would see those old couples walking, holding hands. And it would be just like, oh, that's going to be us one day.
So, the funny thing is like I met my husband 23, 24 years ago on J-Date.
I met on J-Date too.
Really?
Yeah. Yes.
And, I remember my journey of dating back then. And I was like, am I ever going to meet somebody? Yes. And, it was tough. And when I met him, I was just like, I just felt like I met my Beshert. And I thought, I'm so happy not to have to date anymore. And you just felt safe. And I never thought in a million years that I would have to date again. I mean, I'm 51. She said, I'm starting another chapter of my life. I don't want to be alone. I feel that as a widow, we come from a place of love and we want to love again. That's what we know. It's not like coming from a divorce where I feel like I need to take years to work on myself. I feel like I am the best version of me. And, so when people say sometimes like, well, I think you should take, a few years to work on you and find you. And I'm like, well, I know who I am and I had the best. I mean, the bar is set very high and, I just have so much love to give again. So
that's beautifully said. And mine was different. I was lost. I didn't have an identity without him. I found out. And, at some point I was into a 1.5 year relationship, which was great. I came alive during that time. But when things settled, I realized everything was about him. I didn't take the time to find out who am I. So when we broke up, it was a blessing. I never, ever regret anything in my dating experience. And, that person brought me back to life, and I will forever be grateful for that. And I will also be forever grateful learning and having the strength to know, wait a minute, this is not good for me. And that's a tough thing, for your first relationship, dating after being a widow. So I personally did have to take time to figure out, who am I and what's my purpose? Mm-hmm. I think everybody after a divorce or becoming a widow, and yes, it's different, but I think you need to kind of learn to love yourself first. And I think it's important to have a purpose. Like, who am I as an individual? Because before you can fall in love, I think you have to love yourself.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, it's interesting because I think now I'm at a place 18 months later that I'm embracing being single. That, at a young age, I was married, and, I'm trying to change my mind frame again, to look at all the pluses of being single, and feel so grateful that what I had, and that I even had that opportunity to have that. Because a lot of people have never experienced that kind of love or relationship.
True.
So I feel like I had that. Mm-hmm. And if I don't ever have it again, I'm okay with that.
Are you though?
I am.
What do you mean by if I don't have, what do you mean? Like when you say that?
Well, as I said, the bar is set high.
Yeah.
And not that I think I will ever have that again.
Yeah.
But if I don't find it, or I don't find something close to that, I'm okay with that.
Okay. So you're saying like, if I don't find a companion, I'm okay on my own.
Right.
And that's very healthy, and like for me though, I got to tell you, I came like a badass independent person and busy. I found a purpose. I surrounded myself with new people, and I enjoy the different things I do in life now. And like you said, I feel like I'm my best version of myself. And so for those of you out there, whether it's becoming a widow, whether it's coming out of being divorced, I think that's the goal. Find the best version of yourself before. It doesn't mean don't date during this journey. It means you really don't know exactly what you need in a relationship until you're your best version of yourself, I feel like. So all those statements I read off in the beginning is counter of what I'm saying. And that comes with the stigmatism, I think, of the word widow. And we don't have to be like that. And this is the purpose of this platform, is to reach out to people so that they can realize, look, there's hope. No one needs to replace your loved one, but you do go on journeys like you and I, and they're unique. But our message is, I'm further along than you, is that, finding out who you are and making your journey and making your decision. So your decision is, if I don't, I'm good. For me, I love my alone time. I always have. With my late husband, we did a lot of independent things. So I tend to be a person that I could never be with somebody 24/7 at my hip. I think I freaking die. And that's very interesting. So when you talk about that moving on part, I was like, okay, here's my checklist. Must have this, must da, 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 da. And everything on my checklist, I would not settle. I was determined that these were my rules, these were my guidelines. And so I started my dating journey after the 1.5 year one with those rules and Nicole's rules and da, 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 da. And I would meet guys that fit everything on that list. And then in the dating experience, I was like, just freaking disaster.
It's interesting because now that I'm trying to date a little bit, we set these rules, but I think those rules come from a place when we were dating back in our 20s, and we are a different people now. And so I think I'm trying to figure out, okay, what are the different rules now? Being open-minded. What I thought I wanted in my 20s is not necessarily now what I need in my 50s. So, it's trying to figure that out.
Yeah. And, I've had people on that came from divorce, and, I think that's a very valid point that you bring up. You can't look at it when you were dating and single in your 20s. And I think personally we have the advantage. And I think, being in your 50s and dating, like, we know our shit. We know what we want. We've been there, done it. We're not looking through the lenses of, is this person good for raising my children? Now, with that said, I want the morals and the values and understanding of my relationship with my kids. And if you don't have that, we're not a good fit. And, I know religion is a big component for you. I personally will only date somebody in my religion, and I think that thinking that you can, have that same rules in your 20s, who wants those rules? It's we are independent. We get to pick a significant other because we kind of know what we're looking for. And you said it very well. We're not looking for the same thing in your 20s. And I think part of that is coming through and understanding, okay, this is what I want to start off with my list. And I know for me personally, like I just started saying, like, I had those rules and I dated those kind of guys, and they were a freaking hot mess. So then I had to reflect back and go, well, okay, Nicole, I don't want to be alone, so I'll just date. I literally, Annette, was at the point where, like, I'm freaking never going to meet anyone. I'm just done. Like, I was just over it. And of course, I met somebody, when I least expected, that many things weren't on that list and much more fulfilling. So, my advice to people is you have to love yourself. You need to find a purpose. You need to figure out what components and attributes and characteristics must you have in a person. Must. Need and must are different. Would you agree about that? Or what are your thoughts about difference between need and must?
Well, I think it's, again, a journey and a process. You kind of go into it thinking I need all these, things. And then, the more you've been out there, you start saying, okay, well, maybe I can take that off. Maybe that's not so important. Right. And so I think it's keeping an open mind and, trying to enjoy finding yourself, being happy, and putting yourself out there sometimes in uncomfortable situations is the hardest thing. And I know, I've been going out and sometimes, it's hard because somebody wasn't like my husband, and I'll get into the car and I will just start bawling. But then I have to remind myself that, everybody's different. No one's going to be the same. And I have to get to that point where I can look at somebody for their own qualities and for who they are.
I like that. That's very well said.
And not compare, and know that, I can
put in compartments.
Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And that's what I'm trying to do. But that's, it's a process for me.
It is a process. And that's why I'm further along than you. And what you're hearing is, everyone has their journey, guys. And, the importance is understanding and feeling like, by listening to like people like Annette and I, that, there is hope. And you won't always be despondent and crying. You will have moments of crying. It doesn't ever just go away. And nobody is looking to, in my mind, no one's going to replace my late husband. But with that said, I'm at a different stage now, like we were talking about. And what I need now is not necessarily what I was looking for when I met my late husband.
Right.
But, I think that, if I could just conclude with saying that, listening to us is understanding that there is a journey. You have to do the work. Don't avoid it, because then you get into toxic relationships. You're not really, you're flip-flopping all over the place. And my thoughts are on this, that you have to be honest with yourself. You have to give yourself time to grieve and find who you are at this new stage of life. Now, while you're going through the journey, date. Because you know what? I remember my first date and I was so nervous. And within a few minutes, it was like, okay, I'm just sitting down talking to someone. It's not easy. It's not. I mean, now I think I'm more comfortable. But it took years to get there.
Right.
I mean, and, things like for me, the idea of even being intimate with a new person. Oh my God. Like just being that vulnerable is a hard step to overcome. And, if I could just let people know you're not alone in that, Annette and I, like we're being honest about, the process and, keeping your eye on the prize. And somebody said something to me really interesting. They said, if you're with somebody and they're not bringing out the best version of you, they're not the right person for you. Mm-hmm. And I loved how simplified that statement is. If that person is not bringing out the best of you, that's how you know they're not the right person for you. And I like that, And, is there any wisdom that you want to leave our viewers with, because of course I told you it would go by fast. Is there anything that you think, if any advice somebody could have given to you, 1, 2, 3 pieces of advice that you want to share with the audience that you think might help somebody?
Well, I will share this analogy that I have, that I think that when we are going through it in the early stages, we're in a lot of pain and we can't understand why this is happening to us. So I often use the analogy of putting together a 1,000-piece puzzle. And I don't know if you've ever done puzzles before, but we open the box and we look at all the pieces and we go, oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. Where do I begin? But we have faith that we know that if we start with the border, we can start putting the border together, and we start with one piece at a time to make a picture. And that piece is like the one piece of, in our life, we have to get through. Every day is another day. And sometimes we don't understand why those things are happening to us, but we have to have faith that it will make sense, that the more I put the pieces together in the puzzle and I make a picture, I can look back and go, oh, now I understand how all those pieces came together. So when we're going through this kind of pain, know that just every day, put one foot in front of the other. And I say this as I'm doing it, because I'm not an expert, but I'm doing it. Yeah. And I get up and I take care of myself every day and my kids and what I need to do. And it doesn't make sense for me yet. I don't understand why I had to go through this, but I hope that one day in the next chapter of my life, I can come to terms and understand why, because I do believe that everything in our life happens for reasons.
Agree.
And I hope that one day I can understand that.
I like that. That's very beautiful what you said. And I want to thank you so much for being brave and talking about something that's so difficult and personal and, a journey. And, this is what I aspire to do, is to be able to be a safe place for women that, are coming out of a divorce, are widows, and hearing like, you're not alone. Like there were days I didn't even want to exist, if I'm honest with myself, And so you're not alone in these emotions of feeling like, how do I get from point A to point B, C, D? And I think the answer is A, B, C. You can't go A to Z.
No, you have to go through it.
Yeah. And you have to go through putting that puzzle together to figure out.
Right. But Nicole, I just want to say, I've been following your journey and, what you've been doing. And I have to say it's amazing for me. It helps me. knowing that I'm not alone and that people like you have gone through it and you've, coming out on the other side. And it's empowering. And, for me, for other women, we need that. So, thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was so sweet. Thank you. And, that's if one person, 1 week, and I do get the DMs and they're private and I'm not going to say anything about them, but they're inspiring and that's what keeps me going. I mean, sometimes I do things funny and off topic, but at the end of the day, it's really about creating a community where people can listen and watch and maybe just realize, okay, I'm feeling this now, but there is hope. And if I can, and that means so much to me, what you said, thank you. I really appreciate that. And at the same time, I want to thank the audience, whether you watch or you listen, to giving me an opportunity to hopefully give you opportunities to hear and see and listen, be inspired or laugh about things. And with that said, thank you for tuning in to another podcast, 50's AF Podcasts. And as Widow to Widow, we hope that we gave some inspiration, we gave you some tidbits and hope. So thank you for tuning in.